All right, we are on the air. Josh, you want to ask a question? Just unmute yourself. Okay. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to try and do in this class is go through the chapters of my book one by one, but not doing it as presenting the book, but rather as getting the ideas in the book. And then if you read the book as background or in advance, that will give you a totally different perspective, hopefully, on what I'm teaching. The book was the first attempt to express, I guess, the things I care about most in life. Reading the first chapter, there are chapters in the code here. Reading the first chapter last night, I realized the first chapter is not even the first chapter. We had all my devices. I tried diagramming it. Over 13 steps in the argument, which is too many steps. But the reason is that I really, the reason I made it the first chapter is that I really, really care about it. So I'm going to try to do it differently tonight, and then you can read the chapter afterwards and see what you got of it. So I'll start this way. When in high school, my best friend Rabbi spent lots of time. I'm sure this is what you did in high school also, debating the question of which comes first, halacha or hashkafa. Right? Are you supposed to derive your values from halacha as a fixed objective thing, which was the impression we had that Rabbi Soloveitchik said in halacha, or are you supposed to have your values first, and then you interpret halacha on that basis? Those were extreme positions, and those extreme positions still exist. There's an interpretation of each halacha that says that halacha is where you have to start from. People still hold that. My friend Rabbi Elisha Solovich is probably the strongest exponent of the position that halacha is just an expression of values, and there's no meaning really to the content of halacha except as you break it into values. I tend to argue for a yachas hagomlim, right? A virtuous circle in which values lead to halacha, lead to values, and you can go in both directions. But I was, I guess, raised intellectually in an environment where there was a very strong bias towards halacha being prior to values, and so I tend to make my argument as values are really important. There are values that are prior to halacha. There are values that you have to interpret halacha in light of. And it doesn't mean, since there are multiple values, it doesn't mean that you can know the outcome of any halachic issue because you know this value. And say, look, there's a value called human dignity. How could the halacha be in this case? It violates human dignity. Well, that's good. It violates human dignity, but it might be in favor of a different value, right? But so that's the basic framework I'm going to argue for. And I'm not going to, this class, I'm not going to try to make the argument for the position that there are values prior to halacha. There are ways to do that. I'm going to argue with it for a specific value. And I'm going to make it that way. The value I want to argue for tonight is freedom. Right? That freedom is a fundamental value that halacha should be interpreted in light of. I'm going to try to show that to some extent it can also be derived from halacha, because if I'm right that freedom is a value that halacha should be interpreted in light of, it should by now have had enough impact in halacha that you can also otherwise but if you can't show freedom in the halachic system, then plainly my argument has a great deal of weakness to it, right? But the framework I'm going to try to argue is for freedom as one of the primary things which you should decide halacha in light of. Okay, that reasonably clear? Okay, so what I want to start by conceding that this is not my chiddush, right? It's not my creative idea. Although I also don't want to tell you that I got the idea from the section, but I want to read. I'm going to read it so that somebody, if you can see that somebody else said it, you can decide whether somebody else is someone who matters to you or not. Right? This is from Rav Shlomo Goren's essay. I've translated as "Human Freedom in the Light of the Torah." I think it's Chirut Adam Be'orat Torah. It's part of an essay on the holidays, which he sets up a whole structure of the Shalosh Regalim in the as an argument about human freedom. But I want to read it as is because I think he makes the argument in a way that either very much anticipates or very much influenced my argument. It's tough for me to know at this stage. I certainly read this essay before I wrote the book. Okay, he says the essential point of departure in the historic experience of the redeemed Jewish nation, when it left the furnace of slavery in Egypt, the solid foundation of our social outlook that serves as motivation, justification, and telos, And here's the key line for me: because of which, and for the sake of which, all events of this world came to be. Right? They're making a very strong claim. Right? This is a theology of history. And all events before and after Yetziat Mitzrayim were framed because of this. Right? Those prior to the Exodus and those following it, and which compelled God to alter the orders of nature and to work the array of open and concealed miracles of that era of Yetziat Mitzrayim, so as to root it in human consciousness, is the Torah of Israel's sacred recognition of human freedom in all the life conditions of individual and public life, and in all social and national conditions, because the human being was created b'tselem Elokim. Okay, so he's making two fundamental claims. One is, which I think is a claim that either strikes you as obvious or not, which is that Yetziat Mitzrayim tells you that God is in favor of freedom. And that, right, Yetziat Mitzrayim, right, so it's that the narrative of Bnei Yisrael in, right, of Bnei Yisrael in Shemot is an expression of God's love of freedom. Yes. Okay, right, so there are challenges to that, right? Maybe God is only in favor of national Jewish freedom, right? Not individual freedom, not human freedom, just national Jewish freedom, right? That's a great question, right? And that I think is, that I think we'll have to address, right? Whether we can make an argument that in a Jewish context, the Exodus stands for more than the capacity of the Jewish people to be free of political domination by Egyptians. Okay, absolutely right. But his claim, right? Just he's like, I'm not the one making it. That's right. Is that the whole purpose of everything was to root in human consciousness the Torah of Israel's sacred recognition of human freedom. Okay, and then he says that by the way, you shouldn't just think this is about Sefer Shemot. He said everything leads up to it also. This also emerges from Sefer Bereshit because freedom is an essential consequence of being created b'tselem Elokim. You can't, right? If you accept that human beings are created b'tselem Elokim, whatever that means, right? I don't think it's a good idea to translate it because Doran had pretty wide bekis, and right, and I don't know which interpretation of the B'tselem Elokim he's using, whether it means in an image sort of like the image of God, or right the way God looks, or does he mean in the intellectual image of God, or does he just mean in a mold that God possessed? Right, which is what Rashi says, right? The whole theological controversy about what B'tselem Elokim is, but whatever B'tselem Elokim means for Goren, it means something that has to be free. That it is right. It's a violation of its nature, of the nature of B'tselem Elokim for it not to be free, and therefore for the Torah to say that human beings are created B'tselem Elokim is to say that human beings are supposed to be free. Okay, Goren is also assuming, I believe, that all human beings are created B'tselem Elokim. We have to bracket that there are interpretations of B'tselem Elokim that narrow it to Jews or some Jews, right? Which we can talk about in another context. But in Goren's context, B'tselem Elokim is a human, right? Is a product of humanity, and I accept that fully. And I'm not going to argue that in this context. Okay, so there's an argument that that the whole narrative of Chumash, from the creation of human being through the creation of the Jewish people, is about instilling the value of freedom, right? The value of the Torah of human freedom. And if that, right, then he has lots of rhetoric about every subordination of one human being to another, whether willing or coerced, injures the purity of his connection to divinity and his obligations to heaven. So that gets us into another problem, which is when we talk about human freedom because of the B'tselem Elokim, does that mean absolute human freedom? Or does that mean human freedom relative to other human beings, but that freedom is not a value in the relationship of human beings to God? Goren fudges that, I think, and you can read through the section and see it, right? And see if he comes out of that. So, but I want to just get what his argument is. Right? His argument is that if you read Bereshit properly, if you read Shemot properly, right, you understand the purpose of the world is to get human beings to understand the value of freedom. If that's the case, it's inconceivable that halacha won't reflect that. And Goren, in fact, makes very will make halachic arguments for that. Okay, so that's stage one. That's Rav Goren's argument. So I guess first question is: are you convinced that Rav Goren really means it, with all the caveats I put out, right? That and the preface that Mark raised. And secondly is, do you think that his argument is a strong argument, or do you think that this is a really radical thing for someone to say, and it doesn't match your understanding of what the evidence in Judaism is? Which is good. Okay, right. So there are, right. So if you look right on the bottom of the page, right, I wrote there are counterexamples. The counterexamples are A, halacha per se. That's the whole, right? We were setting up a system of halacha, right? So how could you claim that halacha is about freedom? The whole point of halacha is law. Law seems to be an antithesis of freedom. Secondly, there's eved ivri, right? That is the whole, right? Thirdly, there's eved kna'ani. And fourthly, there's the concept of being an eved Hashem. Right? And we could talk about the rhetorical nuances of whether you think that the purpose is to be an eved Hashem or an oved Hashem.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, just ways
Yeah.
feels like with that first and last one, the whole point is that you have it's something to get yourself to a lot. So that's conception of freedom.
Okay, so you're reading him that way. I think he has two things. One is he talks about the connection to God, and secondly, he talks about subordination to God. So I don't think it's the same argument, but I agree with you that it's easy to read him that way. And then that question goes away. You're just like he doesn't argue for the full concept of freedom. You have to ask why how does that fit his notion of Selem Elohim having to be free? Only free in certain ways, right? Lots of complications. Yes, ma'am. Right, so that's part of halacha, right? Right? Do we think of okay, you can imagine a much more democratic halacha. Right, and you would say that's in accordance with freedom. Okay, good. So those are all right. If you look at the structure of halacha, as generally understood, does not seem to be focused on maximizing the freedom of its adherents.
And I don't really think all of this trying to start saying if you're living outside of our religious Zionist world and you're subjugating yourself to the laws of another country.
Yes, that's also right. That's a fair. That could be a particular halachic constraint, right? It could be that his conception of freedom is going to end up being more collective than individual in terms of the Jewish people, right? Those are all fair points. I would say yes.
No, I'm just thinking.
Okay, good. So we'll get to that kind of point as well. Yes, David.
And so not touching on the fact that the whole experience of Brian is supposed to be around us to the freedom of the even though that slavery in some ways is we have to be sensitive to
So I think that is his point. I think he's with there, right? He's saying the whole point of everything was to teach human beings that freedom is important. And now we have a problem. Okay, but so we could say, you know what? But okay, it's an important value, but there are other values that eved ivri somehow overcome, right? We could try to do it. You have to explain eved ivri, right? I think you certainly have to explain halacha, and you have to come up with some kind of notion of what it means to be a religious being not in a relationship of equals with God that is compatible with this. So he hasn't done the work, I would say, right? And something he doesn't want to do, right? He's not, I think, bothered necessarily by the problem of being an eved Hashem. He would, I'm sure, be bothered by eved ivri, but he'll explain it in some way, which I think is not, which I will do as well. I'm open that I want to push for the most radical version that I can. Right, and I want to take what I find compelling is his statements and his reading of Rachel and Shemot. So I want to emerge with freedom as having an influence at every level of the conversation. That the value of freedom influences your relationship with God. That the value of freedom influences the way in which you implement halacha in general, and the value of freedom affects the way that you implement halacha in specific, and particularly, you have to explain why Avdus isn't the counterexample. That's a very, very strong attempt, and the risk is that it's going to degenerate into semantics, Because one of the ways you do that is by having conversations about different kinds of freedom. And the challenge, and this is, if you listen to the podcast that this summer's SPM students put on the first chapter, you'll see like that was the issue that they pushed really hard about, was to some extent, right, if you allow freedom to have multiple meanings, does that mean that you're just fudging and just call one of those freedom slavery in life is good? right, and you might be engaged in Orwellian tactic. One of the things driving this, which we'll meet again later in the Makarot, is Isaiah Berlin's essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, which I reread in preparation for this class. I should have reread before writing the chapter in the book, which is a cautionary tale about the ways in which certain kinds of rhetoric of freedom become totalitarian. So that's a test, right? That the argument I'm making has to be subjected to. Okay, I'm going to try and build a complicated textual argument through Torah now, through Torah and rabbinic interpretations of Torah, and I'm going to try and use that to get to both the complicated definitional issues and to solving some of the counterexamples. But you can challenge me in the middle. I'm just going to say up front, I'm not going to start off by dealing with the counterexamples, but I'll do them in the context of this argument. Okay, so the way I started from it is there's a famous quote in the chapter that might or might not be that appended to Pirkei Avot, where the line is, right, we have the phrase that the writing is the writing of God, chiseled, engraved, whatever it is on the tablets. And there's a pun, al tikri charut ela cherut, right, that we revocalize it. And instead of charut al luchot, read as kerut al luchot. And the line is ein lecha ben churin, which ben churin is somebody who is free. That's our right. Different occasion we could try and distinguish between ben churin and chafshi. Ela mish osek b'talmud Torah. So that's a narrower statement than we might want, because it talks about learning Torah specifically, as opposed to living Torah. That distinction is elided mostly in later sources. But there's a statement which just rhetorically embodies what I want. Right, that somehow Torah is a source of freedom, and in fact, Torah is the source of the only true freedom. Right, so I tried to embody that in the book. Right, at the end of the chapter, I wrote, right, that as a balmot, right, ein lecha ben churin ela misho osek b'Torah, ein lecha ben Torah ela misho osek b'chirut. Right, that if Torah is about freedom, so then to be a ben Torah, right, means that you have to see yourself as engaged in freedom. And I wanted to, in addition to the counterexamples, I want to put out a couple of ways in which this plays out in the life of a regular halachic. Yes. If it's in Torah, I don't know why living Torah can't be the best embodiment of universal value. Right, then we can talk about whether what it means for non-Jews to live a Torah life, right? Then we get into much bigger theological issues. Right, does it involve conversion? Right, does not? Yeah, I think I can bracket those for the purposes of this class. Okay, so here are a number of ways in which freedom as a halachic value plays out. One is the value of freeing agunot. Right, so freeing agunot, right? That's a case where you have all sorts of values about the morality of the system and the sexual fidelity and social roles and things like that. But you can just say, you know what? But people have the right to be free, and to be in a situation where someone else controls your choices is a violation of a fundamental Torah principle. And so the reason that you're engaged, and I spend a lot of time engaged in trying to free agunot is because they deserve to be free, right? Because they have the right to be free. Second is patient autonomy in medical ethics. Right? Do you think that fundamentally all the choices about how you balance risk, costs, and benefits in terms of quality of life versus quantity of life, and what sort of risk you will take, do you think all those things should be determined by the system, or do you think that fundamentally there should be room for people to make their own decisions in that area? So I have a very strong bias towards patient autonomy in medical halacha. Right, not everyone does, right? So that's an area where there's a real nafkaminas, whether you see freedom as a value or not. Third is whether you think fundamentally that the leaders should be elected. There's right. If you look at halachic tradition, there's a very strong bias towards elected leadership at every level, which often doesn't play out. Right? Often leadership ends up being chosen in some form of a self-selecting oligarchy. And if you look at it, atomistically, shuls elect their rabbis. Nobody thinks shuls shouldn't elect their rabbis. Right, principals of schools are chosen by boards that are chosen by at every level. Right, at every level, there's really little basis in halacha for saying that people with authority get to decide who leads, as opposed to the people who are led get to decide who has authority. But again, if you're not conscious of that, then you tend to, I think you tend to de-emphasize that. Although I think that and you can also argue that maybe the emphasis on democracy is a medieval phenomenon because of the exigencies of the Jewish community. But if you go back to Sanhedrin, etc., you'll get much more appointed system. I have a shiur called "Should the judges of the Sanhedrin be elected?" Building off of Cook's argument that I believe they should. Right, so I try to deal with all those classically. But again, it'll make a difference, right, whether you have a bias or not. If you think that that's part of the values of the system, so of course you'll be biased towards picking out from the sources that are in favor of elected leadership. And if you don't think it's a value, so then you might just say, okay, we're a monarchistic system with a self-selecting oligarchy as its traditional legislative body, and just go home. Okay, fourth example is labor law. So that many of you know from the shiur law that I spent.
All right. Executive was historically not.
Nope. I don't know that's true. The king, the founders of dynasties are elected. The choice among the successors are elected. And what happens if the population no longer wishes that king? We only have one example, which is the breakup of the Israelite kingdom, which no one ever claims is non-halachic. No one ever claimed there's an obligation of the Israelite kingdom to resubmit to the Davidic monarchy. Dr. Melka Senkovich gave a really fun shiur at a CNCL conference about 15 years ago. It was really interesting, right? We have these biases, but we have a dream of a messianic king. And then the second thing is the king more than a figure is. That's an article I published in other contexts that I think that there's no. Maharatz Chaya says it, or Shol Yisraeli says it. I think it's utterly compelling in Rambam that there is no the king is a sovereign figurehead unless the population chooses to give the king more power than him. Right, that's the understanding of the difference between the totally negative description of the king's powers in Deuteronomy and the positive description in Joshua and Samuel. All of these things, by the way, again, this is a life position, so you're welcome to ask me for all the articles I'm quoting. Pardon? Well, it's very negative, right? But it's especially negative because he's opposed to that, or negative because okay, right. Well, the question is appointing a king a mitzvah at all, right? A Abravanel, things like that. We do seem to have a Davidic monarchy as an ideal. But
even when Shaul and David are either down, then that's okay.
And it has to be popularly ratified. Okay, right. I think that's right. I think that, and again, none of I'm not trying to make freedom as the only value. So you could always claim that, right? Each of those could be exceptions. What I'm telling you is I'm going to pick that there are interpretations that are more compatible with freedom, and I'm going to pick all those, and I'm going to try to argue that those are the more compelling interpretation in each case. I'm not trying to make an evidentiary based argument. I'm just trying to what I'm trying to show nafkaminas. Right? What would change, right? So it will change if you think freedom is a value. Is you will have much more of a value on freeing agunot, perhaps. You will, you will have a much more of a bias towards giving people freedom in making moral choices rather than determining them. Or Halacha should be giving them options as opposed to determining them. You'll have much more of a bias towards believing that leadership should be elected. You'll have much more of a bias towards labor laws that allow for worker mobility, and you'll have a bias towards public welfare laws that don't create dependency. And that's a whole notion of a freedom-based agenda. I don't want to call it libertarian agenda because we'll get the politics. Pardon? Yeah, right. So all ways. Give me that. Okay. We talked about the counterexamples, and there are a set of issues, right, of definitions that should be given before we make the textual argument. The first is, and this is where Isaiah Berlin's, this usually is framed the difference between freedom from and freedom to. Right, freedom from is that no one else constrains me. We have to be very careful that no one else constrains me. Does that mean God doesn't constrain me? Does it mean no other person constrains me? Or does it mean I have no constraints? And in addition to that being constrained, because they feel like, am I free if I can't fly? Right? Do wings make me freer? In a sense that matters to this purpose, or wheels. And there's a second notion of freedom to. So flying is one example, but where it becomes much more complicated is when you talk about freedom to be something, because there are things that, in order to become them, you have to narrow your choices in the short term. And right, there's an easy example, right, which is you're not free to both both sexually explore and experience lifetime monogamy, right? That's choices you can't, right? You have to choose among them. There are all sorts of choices that give you freedom in the moment, but preclude things long term. I put on Facebook today, Isaiah Berlin's claim. It did not meet with favor among my auditors, that certain kinds of individuality, individualism flourish as much in disciplined societies as they do, right, as they do in liberal societies. It was an interesting claim, right? So one person correctly said, that our vision of the great yeshivot, often we're right, the people who come out of them are really strong individuals, even though they live in a very particular kind of thing. This, New England Puritanism develops all sorts of people who are highly individual and secure in themselves. On the other hand, they live within a constrained environment, right? They're not going off and becoming Buddhists, one day and the Jews the next day, and then being Christians the third day, right? They live with certain constraints, but they have a strong sense of individualism. So that's an interesting question empirically. It's true. Mental health component? Okay. It could be that too much freedom is not sustainable, and people need. Yeah, could be. It could be that certain kinds of freedom develop only in reaction, and right, you need to rebel against something in order to have, right. There's certain Right, so we understand that about children. Right, often, right, we argue that children need discipline, right, in order to develop, and maybe adults do also. Maybe societies do. Then we get into let's say, if I want to be a really great team basketball player, I need 9 other people willing to play basketball with me. Well, that's a combination of a lot of speed, right? And ultimately, but I say, there are lots of things you can't do except in the collective, and if everyone else chooses otherwise, you just can't have that experience, and you can't develop yourself. So, to what extent to what extent are your choices constrained in that way, and to what extent do you say, well, my freedom to do X is more, right, requires other people, and it allows me perhaps to coerce other people to engage in activities that will enable me to have that, right, to have that sort of freedom.
My impression of freedom is bring somebody else.
Sure. Right. So everyone understands, right? I think that, whether, so you have fundamentally the Machlokas Hobbes and Rousseau, right? Whether what would happen in a state of nature, right? Is just the strongest, right? Is life nasty, British, and short, because, right, the strongest just win. And so you need to constrain everyone's freedom, because otherwise, right, no one will have any freedom at all. Right? Or Rousseau argued that no, actually, you could imagine a world in which everyone was really free. And the reason you need to constrain freedom is to enable society to achieve certain things, right? For freedom to, not freedom from. Right? That's a fair, but I think most people don't have, understand that in the world as we live it, absolute freedom would probably lead to those people whose freedom involves killing other people, killing everyone until they got it right. And that would be eventually you'll have to constrain the people whose freedom involves expressing power without conscience. Right? So you have to figure out in a society, right? So now once you understand that you can't have an absolutely liberal society, so you have to figure out what are the constraints, right? What constraints are worth it for what purposes, the constraints are worth it to some extent, and you frame those constraints as, well, we're going to inhibit everyone's freedom for the sake of enabling everyone's freedom from, or are we also willing to say we're going to inhibit people's freedom for the sake of enabling freedom to? Right? And that's the point at which you run into the possibility of an Orwellian thing. Let's say, right, true freedom is being an Eved Hashem, and so I'm going to enforce everyone to refrain from everything which prevents them from being Eved Hashem, so they can experience freedom. Right? And that's a rhetorical move that you will find, among rabbinic figures surely all the time. Right, that we're not actually taking away your freedom, your freedom from, right? We are taking away your freedom from for the sake of your freedom to, and eventually someday you will realize that, that we enabled you to achieve something you could not have achieved any other way. That there's that maybe individually you could be something, but there's something that we can't achieve nationally, right? That's what we call fascism. And a fancy way to say the temptation to say that everything is for the sake of freedom to collectively is fascism. The temptation to say everything is for the sake of freedom to individually is Puritanism. The temptation to say that really no, actually all that there should be is individual freedom is the ultimate value is Nietzscheism. That means the person, ultimately the person with power is the power, it gets to make their own values and impose on everyone else. And then you constrain everyone else's because everyone else's freedom is a constraint on your freedom. Okay, that sets out the problems. Developing a Jewish theology of freedom should have to address all these in great depth. It's not my ambition tonight to develop a theology of Jewish freedom. It's not really my ambition in life to do it either. But I want to have all this in mind to understand that that what I'm trying to do is just rooted as a value in Halacha is complicated and is easily distorted. And also, when I try and set out the argument I'm making to, say, is a more detailed argument of Rav Goren's approach, which leads, I think, to entrenching the broader concepts of freedom that I want. Right, so you'll understand what the considerations are that enable me to do. Okay, questions? Okay. Let's go on to page 2 then. Okay, so there is a question, the question that Rashi opens his parish on Chumashin, and that I assume everyone goes through some stage in their life where they're obsessed by this, is the question of why the Torah starts where it does, instead of with HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, which is the first mitzvah. So there are lots of ways to, and Rashi gives the answer, because, so that we'll know that we own Eretz Yisrael. That's a whole separate conversation. Ramban gives an ethical inflection of Rashi's answer, which I think is very important. And Ramban says the whole story is to teach you that you only have a right to land when you deserve it. It's not about the property of Eretz Yisrael per se. But the premise of the question appears to be that Halacha is primary. Okay, so that's interesting, right? So you think it's the other way around, right? Because okay, so so you don't like Rashi's question. You're not going to try and find a way where Rashi's question means something, and yet we give a different answer than Rashi gives. Right? But I want to start with that question, right? That question sounds like it's a halacha. The Torah per se should only be law. Narrative is only included for background information. And Rashi gives his own answer. And the pasuk Rashi thinks it should start from HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim, which is Shemot Yud Bet, which is at the beginning of Nisan, which is the first day of Nisan in the year of the Exodus. Right, so right before they actually leave Egypt, but not actually the day, right? Because they leave on Pesach, right? So 14 days before they actually leave Egypt. Right, that's when the Torah should start. Okay, but there is a pasuk in series of pasukim in Yirmiyah, Perek Lamed Dalet, verse number 6. Right, where this is like a wild series of nested quotes, right? The word of God comes to Yirmiyah saying, "This is what God said. I said the following." Right? God said, "I said the following." Right? Unquote. Right. So what the book says that Yirmiyah says that God said is, "I made a covenant with your ancestors on the day that I took them out of the land of Egypt, the house of slaves, saying, at the end of 7 years you must send off. Each man his brother Hebrew may be sold to you. he will have served you 6 years, and then you must send him off free away from you. But your ancestors did not obey me, did not incline their ears. I'm sorry, Josh, I should have just shared my screen to card on. Okay. So Yirmiyah claims, right, that God said, right, and this is the context, right, where Yirmiyah has gotten them to send, right, to free their Jewish slaves, and then they all, right, that it doesn't last, right? It's a very short term affirm. But in the context of the claim that God says, I made this covenant with you on the day that I took them out of the land of Egypt. Right, meaning that this is, it's sounding like this is why I took you out of Egypt, right? This was the foundational principle. But this law that you, right, that slaves only serve 6 years and then on the 7th they have to free, shows up in Parshat El HaMishpatim, which is in chapter 21, which is after the Aseret Dibrot, which presumably is after the day on which God took you out of Egypt. Okay, right, so we have a problem in the narrative. Either way, it seems like this is not, right, that this might still make it after HaKodesh Hazel Lachem, right? Even when Rashi wants to start the Torah, this will still be included because it happens after that. But there's an interesting pasuk in Shemot Perek Vav, which says the following: "Vaydeber Hashem Moshe el Aaron, vayitzaveim el bnei Yisrael ve'el Paro melech Mitzrayim, v'hotzi et bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim." It is a puzzling pasuk because it has no content. Right? God speaks to them, He commands them, but it says, right, towards Paro and the Jews, but there's no, right, what did He say to them? Okay, there's a missing subject. So the Yerushalmi, now we're on source number 9. Yerushalmi quotes from Shmuel Bar Yitzchak is saying, "Vayitzaveim el bnei Yisrael al matzivam al parshat shiluach avadim." That the missing content is Parshat Shiluach Avadim, meaning the missing content is Parshat Mishpatim, beginning of Parshat Mishpatim. Now, if you look at the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, you'll notice that Parshat Mishpatim peculiarly shows up in the middle of nowhere. Right? No one knows what it's doing chronologically where it shows up. Right? No one knows what it's doing literally where it shows up. All right? After Parshat Yisro, all of a sudden it says Ve'ela Mishpatim. Right? So Ve'ela implies that there was some list before it, but there wasn't. So a reasonable solution that many commentators adopt is that Parshat Mishpatim, at least according to this Yerushalmi, was said in chapter 6, but is only included in the Chumash here. And biyom, right? And biyom Tziyah Bnei Yisrael Meretz Mitzrayim means the day that I commanded you to take, right? Tziyah Bnei Yisrael was the day that I began the process of taking you out of Tziyah Mitzrayim, as opposed to the day of the Exodus. If you take that together, right, what you have is that at the moment that God begins the Exodus, He also includes a restriction of slavery. And this is prior to HaKodesh Hazel Lachem. So even if Rashi were right, the first mitzvah is not HaKodesh Hazel Lachem anymore. The first mitzvah is the ban against permanent slavery. And moreover, I think this fits in very well with Rav Doran's thesis that the purpose of the narrative is to entrench the value. So if God says to Bnei Yisrael at the very beginning, right, look, right, I'm going to take you out of Egypt, and here is the right, make sure that you internalize this value. Right, so then I think you have a much stronger argument for setting it up that way. So I really like that notion. Then we understand why the Aseret Dibrot begin at Shor Seticha to try and Beit Avadim. That it's not just right. So the beginning of the Aseret Dibrot can be understood solely as a claim of authority, but I think it's more powerful if you understand it as a value statement. Right, I am the God who took you out of Egypt, and therefore right, you should interpret everything I'm telling to you in light of, right, the God who took you out of Egypt. This, I think, is possibly the position of the Sefer Mitzvot Gedolot, who thinks that the mitzvah of Anochi is that God, that you should understand that the God who is instructing you here is the same God who took you out of Egypt. Right? Anochi is a claim of identification. Not I, the one speaking presently, but I am the same God. Right? I am the same God who took you out, who took you out of Egypt. Also, right, the one of the modern anthologies to the Daf al Hadaf, right, to Rosh Hashanah, points out this would be a very nice explanation of why there's a shofar at Har Sinai when they started Dibur given, because it's the same as the shofar of Yovel. Right, the shofar is a symbol of freedom. Yes. Yeah. Yirmiyah says, yeah, okay, good question, good point. That's probably why I should have been sure. As far as translation, probably better than mine. The case is a complicated term. I probably should be at the time of 7 years and ambiguous. Yeah, right, but but if you want to try it and reconcile them, that's probably the right way, and I would slap you at that. Good catch. Yes.
Taking me back.
I assumed it would. Yes. So we'll talk about with the slavery thing. Right? I haven't gotten to the paradox of slavery yet. I'm just pointing out, right, that Yirmiyah clearly presents this as a limitation of slavery. Right? I was like, why not ban it entirely? Right. So the easy answer is, well, look, you couldn't even get that implemented, right, as every 7th year, right? So you try to ban it entirely. No, right, that's the easy answer. I want a more complicated answer, but that's the easy answer. Okay, right. So we spent all of last year on sources 12 and 13. Brendan, yes.
A lot of this is a little
Yeah.
But it's a little bit like a really very smart. I mean, it's not the only place that this phrase appears. Where it's talking about other.
Yeah, it's not literal because I'm making it early. It's not actually. I'm not saying it's Nisan 15th. I'm saying is right. It's when Moshe first and Aaron are first commanded. Right. So it's not literal either. But what I'm saying is it is the way that Yerushalmi understands it. Because that Yerushalmi puts it into the pasuk by Yitzavim b'nei Israel. Right. Source number 9. Right. That's right. And then if you read the rhetoric of Yirmiyah, it sounds like there's a covenant. Right. We don't have it. Right. So the covenant is missing. So we have to put. Right. So there's a flaw in the narrative anyway because there's no covenant. In Mishpatim about Shula Hodis. I think it's a reasonable argument. I don't. Chat and Chumash, I'm not claiming. Chat and Yerushalmi, I am claiming. Okay. Right. And then we spent a lot of time this year, last year, trying to show how the phrase "Kili b'nei Israel avadim," right, in Vayikra, right, the avadayim is interpreted to say "V'lavadim lavadim," right, which is where we have the paradox in Halacha itself that there is a prohibition against making Jews slaves, even though there is a parsha called Shiloh called Eved Ivri. Right. So my argument always is that there's no way that it can be accidental that Chazal understand there's being an isur of being Eved Lavadim when there's a parsha. They understand full well there's a parsha of the Torah called Eved Ivri, and they still create a halacha which says you can't be Evedim Lavadim. Just as there's no way that God didn't understand that putting Eila Mishpatim Asher Tasim L'Tzehem Kisik Eved Ivri right after Anochi Hashem Lokecha Asher Tzitich and Mitzrayim is going to raise hackles. So there has to be a way of reconciling it. So one way of reconciling them is the historical progression thesis. Right, all of you know, right? You start by quoting the Rambam and Karbanos in Mar Nevuchim, and you argue about what the Rambam really means about what it means that Karbanos were a concession to the people. Right, then it's easy to move to slavery. Then you Rav Nachman Rabbanovich did that already, and say there's this historical progression over time. And then, of course, people have their own hobby horses as to what modern things they want. Right? They want to fit Torah into it. Everyone draws their line in some places and no, that's ridiculous, and I'm not going to try and move through that. I don't want to argue that about Avdut, but as I tried to argue last year about Eved Ivri, actually Eved Ivri very specific, right? It's the other way around. The Avdut that is allowed by the Torah is for Jews is not Avdut at all, because it enables the worker to break their contract whenever they want. You can always buy your way out. Right, but actually the Torah is making the other point by calling it Avdut, even though it's actually just a long-term contract that is paid in advance. Right, the Torah is making a much stronger point about how, in fact, all restrictions on freedom, including those of ordinary employment, are morally troubling. And it's not actually the kind of avdut that should be morally prohibited. And I tried to show all last year that a lot of halacha is playing with this question, like to what extent does our visceral dislike for slavery play out in our understanding of labor law, which isn't slavery, right? But it's just a product of power differentials owing to differences in economic circumstances. So I think Eved Ivri is not so hard to split. Eved Kanani is much trickier. Eved Kanani really is slavery. And there's even a prohibition against freeing it, right? The worst thing is there's a prohibition against freeing an Eved Kanani. Right? It's taken as an assay. You must work them forever, and therefore it's forbidden to free an Eved, right? That came up in the conversation we had when we had trouble getting finishing the minyan for mitzvah, but whether you can count the golem to a minyan or not, because Rabbi Eliezer frees a slave in violation of this prohibition in order to make a minyan, and the Achronim ask, why didn't you just make a golem? Obviously, a golem doesn't count to a minyan. He would have done that rather than violate a prohibition, right? To which the answer is no, it would have been showing off to make a golem. And right, which teaches you that the prohibition against showing off overcomes the Torah prohibition against freeing slaves. Right, you get all sorts of fun play. That's why I didn't make a golem what we needed to make today. Unless any of you should think that I am not capable of making a golem. However, I do not think that is the actual. Anyways, I might need some equipment also, which I had, but I should have, knowing that we sometimes have trouble getting them in, I should have brought it. I would have, had I not realized it would be Euro to do so. I don't think that's the right answer. So I'm going to suggest an answer that qualify for good or ill. It's obviously an apologetic, and there's a whole discussion of what apologetics mean. It doesn't fit all the evidence. It fits a certain piece of evidence very well. So the piece of evidence that fits very well is that the prohibition is a biblical prohibition against freeing a slave, and making a minyan is at most a rabbinic obligation. So why should it be permitted to free us, right, to violate a biblical Isur Aseh, right, positive prohibition, in order to fulfill the rabbinic obligation of making a minyan? So if you look at the Rishonim in various degrees, and I like the formulation of the Aryeh, it's most extreme version, what he says is actually there is no standard whatever for what sort of mitzvah that's not, depends on which, like, one Gemara says mitzvah shani, one Gemara says mitzvah the Rabbim shani. Let's work on the mitzvah shani. We don't need the Rabbim. That there is no standard whatsoever for what sort of mitzvah you need to free an Eved. Any nidnud mitzvah, any tinge of mitzvah is enough to free an Eved. Now, what kind of biblical prohibition is it that can be overcome by any tinge of mitzvah? So I think the answer is as follows. Eved Kanani does serve as an Eved, but they do so as a sort of religious internship, because an Eved Kanani who is freed becomes Jewish. Right, that's a given in Halacha. Eved Kanani who is freed becomes Jewish. Also, standard halacha is more comfortable is that an Eved Kanani cannot be held for more than a year unless he or she agrees to be part of this, right, to accept upon themselves the mitzvot that are incumbent upon an Eved Kanani, right, accept mitzvot non-growth. So it actually has to be a willing religious apprenticeship. Okay, now, how does that relate to the question of prohibition of freeing? So what I want to argue is that an essential element of being Jewish, and this is part of the whole argument made so far, is that we know that we owe our freedom to God. Right? The whole grounding of the authority of Torah is, I am God who took you out of Egypt. So we can't allow someone to be Jewish because human beings freed them. Because then they owe their freedom to human beings. So we say is the only way in which you can free an Eved Kanani is if you have a religious reason to do so, in which case they owe their freedom to God. And that's why there's no standard at all. So it's not actually a prohibition. It's just a claim. It's just a framework. You have to generate a situation such that they owe their freedom to God. And so if you understand Eved Kanani as religious apprenticeship, and there's actually no prohibition against ending it, but the whole purpose is you end up being Jewish and owing your freedom to God, and then you understand that the definition of being Jewish is in the recognition you owe your freedom to God. So I think Eved Kanani, there are cases that this doesn't work for. I think for that evidence, it works extremely well, and that would hopefully counter that counterexample fairly well. Right, the Torah doesn't have any interest in non-Jewish slavery. It would be opposed to it. Right, there's a particular form of conversion that allows for an interim state. Okay. Okay, that leaves us. I have one more move that I want to make, which is that Goren, and I think what I've tried to provide a more nuanced and more in some ways more specific and therefore broader argument for rooting the value of freedom as prior to Halacha in the narrative of Shemot. But Goren made an argument around Tselem Elokim also. And I want to try and root that argument in a very particular way, which will relate to the philosophic issues we've talked about, and then that's probably the way we'll finish it. So there's a midrash. This is source number 14, right on page 4. That one of my favorite midrashim. Rabbi says in the name of Rav, when God wanted to, it's a pun on, right? You all know the pasuk says Naaseh Adam b'Tzalmenu, and the question is, right, why is it plural? So one of the solutions to saying Naaseh Adam b'Tzalmenu is not as plural, but it's a question mark, right? Now shall we, right? Actually, that God is asking the angel. The reason it's a plural is that God is asking the angels. Naaseh Adam b'Tzalmenu. So you have the story in which God creates angels, and he asks them, should we create human beings? And they say no, and God destroys them. And so God creates a second group of angels and says, should I create human beings? And they say no, so God destroys them. Then then God creates a third group of angels, and they say, you don't really want an honest answer. And then, of course, after the flood, they come back, right? They come back and say, "Ha, we told you so." And God says, "Yeah, okay, but I took this on willingly." So what does that mean? Right? What does it mean for angels to say no and God to create them anyway? So it seems to me that at least a powerful way of understanding is as follows: before God creates human beings, there's only one will in the world. It's his. And angels aren't free. And so angels have to be representing God's best interest because they can't oppose God. And so what the dialogue tells us is that God has complete freedom from in creation. What he doesn't have is freedom to, and you can say that could be a whole for all the theological things you need, because God doesn't have the capacity to enter into an ethical relationship. So there's no being towards whom he can have responsibilities. God doesn't have the capacity to enter into any kind of relationship, right? In any kind of free relationship, because there is no being that is free. So the creation of human beings is God's choice of freedom to over freedom from. And the narrative, the whole narrative of Chumash is framed by, on the one hand, God's freedom, on the other hand, by God's willing choice to sacrifice his freedom from for freedom to. Now then we can talk about, so what are human beings supposed to learn from this? And how does that influence our understanding of what freedom is? But the value of creating human beings is that we are free. Right? What enables God's freedom to is our freedom from. Right? God has to create a free being, which is what the angels are. Right? The angels are worried about, right? Because here's a being. You're creating beings who will do things that are not the things that you want. So it seems to me that Rav Goren's claim that this is part of Tselem Elokim is not just a definitional argument in the word Tselem Elokim, which you can read or not, but is a fundamental understanding of what the purpose of creation is. The purpose of creation is for there to be free human beings. But that freedom is complicated because A, we can't have God's freedom, God's initial freedom from. That's a fantasy. Right? If we try for God's freedom from, this is, I think, the story of Cain and Hevel. We just end up killing everyone else because the only way you can have freedom from is if no one else exists. So it's complicated because we can't have God's freedom from, and because in creating us, where God is thereby valuing our freedom from Him, He's also sacrificing His freedom from for freedom to. So I think it's a useful metaphor for tying together all the constants of freedom that we have, and then for thinking about it. Okay, so when we constrain it in the same way that, let's say we have a problem of Agunot, which we want to free it, but we also don't necessarily, right? We could construct a system which marriage was not binding, but that limits the kind of relationships people can. This is aside from the egalitarian question. But we could just we could create no fault divorce. Right? But you might not want to do that because it might be that there are things that are enabled by commitment. That then our goal is to mitigate the costs as opposed to assume that freedom is the freedom from, right? Freedom from restriction, the freedom to mate with whomever you want is the only value at all. So I don't claim to have solved it at all. Again, the purpose of the shir is not to construct the theology of a Jewish theology of freedom, but just to argue that it's plausible, maybe even compelling, that freedom is one of the values that you should bring to halacha and that you should interpret halacha in light of, without knowing that freedom is complicated, knowing that there are other values, knowing that that freedom often requires some people to sacrifice for other people to have, everyone to sacrifice, all those sorts of things. Okay, that's my share number one. Are there questions? Okay, thank you. The shul has agreed that if you have not already bought the book and you intend to be part of the class, that I have copies of the book, and the shul will authorize my my printing.
Okay.
Right?
I should.
You already own them. Okay, yes, they're on sale on Amazon now. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. That was a share. Yeah, every once in a while things show up. Mine is only on sale for $14.40 so far. Yeah.
See.